What followed was 2 hours of the most lively HOA meeting in Oakwood Estates history. Residents lined up to share their experiences. Patricia photographing their children's chalk drawings to document sidewalk defacement. Patricia measuring the height of lawn grass with a ruler. Patricia sending certified letters about unapproved bird feeders. A former board treasurer revealed that Patricia had spent over $4,000 of HOA funds on enforcement actions in the past year alone, including private investigator fees to document a teenager's unauthorized basketball hoop. Throughout it all, Patricia attempted to regain control, citing bylaws and procedures, her voice growing increasingly shrill as her authority visibly crumbled. The meeting reached its climax when Darren Washington, a new homeowner who had moved in just before James, stood up. A corporate attorney by profession, Darren had come prepared with visual aids. "I've analyzed our HOA bylaws compared to state regulations," he explained, displaying a chart on his tablet. "I've highlighted 37 instances where our current enforcement practices potentially violate state law, including selective enforcement, improper notice, and exceeding authority." Darren paused for effect, looking directly at Patricia. "I've also drafted a simplified set of guidelines that protect property values without turning our neighborhood into a police state. Copies are being emailed to everyone now." As phones throughout the room pinged with incoming mail, Patricia finally lost her composure. "This is a coup. I've given 15 years to this community. I've kept out the riff-raff and maintained our standards while you've all been enjoying your property values." "Actually," piped up a quiet voice from the corner, "I'm a real estate appraiser. Our values have grown at exactly the same rate as the surrounding non-HOA neighborhoods. The difference is they don't pay $325 annual dues for the privilege of being harassed about their mailbox colors." By meeting's end, a new interim board had been elected, with Frank as president and James, despite his protests about being too new, appointed to the landscaping committee. A full audit of HOA finances was ordered, and Patricia's position as president was suspended pending review. As the meeting adjourned, James found himself surrounded by neighbors introducing themselves and sharing garden tips. "My wife makes the best salsa from homegrown tomatoes," offered one. "I have extra cucumber seedlings if you'd like some," said another. Patricia stormed out alone, her 15-year reign effectively ended by a vegetable garden. James Chen wiped sweat from his brow as he hauled the last moving box into his new craftsman-style home in Oakwood Estates. At 32, after years of cramped apartment living and saving every penny, he finally had his own piece of the American dream, complete with a bay window, hardwood floors, and a backyard that caught the afternoon sun perfectly. "You need a hand with that?" called a friendly voice from next door. An older man with silver hair waved from his driveway. "I'm good, thanks," James called back, offering a tired smile. "But I wouldn't say no to local restaurant recommendations later." 3 days into homeownership, James was already in love with the quiet streets and the way morning light filtered through the kitchen windows. While unpacking his home office, he discovered a weathered notebook lodged behind a built-in bookcase. Inside were handwritten notes about a garden that once thrived in the backyard, heirloom tomatoes, peppers that won a county fair ribbon, herbs that perfumed the air on summer evenings. Inspired, James headed to the local nursery and returned with seedlings, organic soil, and a newfound excitement. The previous owners had left a raised garden bed that was now overgrown but salvageable. Rolling up his sleeves, James began clearing weeds and turning soil, imagining fresh caprese salads made with tomatoes from his very own garden. He was so absorbed in his work that the sharp ahem startled him enough to drop his trowel. Standing at the edge of his garden was a woman in her 50s, immaculately dressed in white linen pants and a pastel blouse despite the weekend casualness of the neighborhood. Her blonde highlighted bob didn't move an inch as she tilted her head disapprovingly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" James straightened up, brushing dirt from his hands. "Just starting a vegetable garden. I'm James, by the way. Just moved in." The woman didn't offer her hand or her name. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began taking photos of his garden bed. "This is a direct violation of Covenant 4.23, she stated, as if reciting scripture. "I'm Patricia Winters, HOA president for the past 15 years. All exterior modifications require prior written approval." James tried to explain that he was simply reviving an existing garden, but Patricia cut him off by thrusting a 3-inch thick binder into his dirt-covered hands. "Our rulebook," she said with the gravity of someone handing over nuclear launch codes. "Page 37 has the landscaping restrictions. Page 94 covers acceptable vegetable varieties. And page 112 outlines the proper procedures for submitting modifications for board approval." As a software engineer, James was no stranger to technical documentation, but this was absurd. "It's just a small vegetable garden in a bed that's already here," he tried again. Patricia's smile tightened. "Rules are rules. The previous owners had grandfathered approval. You do not. The approval meeting is in 3 weeks, and submissions must be entered 14 business days prior, which means," she checked her watch with theatrical precision, "you've missed the deadline for this cycle. You'll need to wait until next quarter." When James politely but firmly explained he intended to continue with his garden, Patricia's friendly facade cracked. Her eyes narrowed as she pulled out her phone. "I've been protecting property values in this neighborhood since before you were playing with action figures, young man. One way or another, you will learn how things work in Oakwood Estates." James stood his ground, the warm soil between his fingers grounding him. "Mrs. Winters, I understand you take pride in the neighborhood. So do I. That's why I bought here. But this garden bed has clearly been here for years. I found the previous owner's gardening journal, and they maintained vegetables here for over a decade." Patricia's nostrils flared. She took 3 steps into James's yard, her spotless white loafers now perilously close to the freshly turned soil. "The Millers had proper paperwork. You do not. And frankly, I'm concerned about your selections." She gestured disdainfully at the seedlings laid out in their biodegradable pots. "Cherokee purple tomatoes. Those aren't on the approved list. And what is this? Thai basil? This is Oakwood Estates, not Bangkok." A flash of anger surged through James. He'd dealt with micromanagers in his professional life, but never someone dictating what he could grow in his own backyard. He took a calming breath, remembering his mother's advice about choosing battles wisely. "I'd be happy to submit the paperwork for the next meeting," he offered, trying for diplomacy. "But since the bed is already established, surely there's some provision for continuing existing features." 6 months passed in a transformed Oakwood Estates. The community newsletter, once filled with violation notices and stern reminders, now featured gardening tips, neighborhood achievements, and announcements for community events. James's garden had flourished beyond his expectations. His heirloom tomatoes had grown so abundantly that he'd started a Saturday morning produce swap in his driveway, which had evolved into a weekly neighborhood gathering. Children played on lawns that were now allowed to feature whimsical decorations, and several houses sported newly painted front doors in previously forbidden colors. The reformed HOA, now operating with transparent and reasonable guidelines, had reduced dues by 40% while increasing community services. The saved funds had been redirected to renovate the neglected playground and install solar lighting along walking paths. Patricia had kept to herself after the meeting, visible only when retrieving her mail or driving to and from her house. Her front yard, once the standard to which others were held, had grown somewhat unkempt, not enough to affect any reasonable property values, but enough to suggest she'd lost interest in maintaining appearances. One Saturday morning, as neighbors chatted over coffee and exchanged garden produce in James's driveway, a hush fell over the gathering. Patricia stood at the edge of the group, clutching a small basket and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. The community service hours mandated by her citation had placed her at the county's 911 call center, where she'd spent weeks listening to genuine emergencies, heart attacks, home invasions, children in danger. The experience had been humbling in ways no one had anticipated. James approached her with a welcoming smile, breaking the awkward silence. "Good morning, Patricia. We've got some great zucchini today if you're interested. She cleared her throat. Actually, I brought something. From her basket, she produced a jar of homemade pickles, my grandmother's recipe. I thought, perhaps someone might enjoy them. It wasn't exactly an apology, but in Patricia's world, it was monumental. Frank appeared at her side, gently guiding her into the gathering with the diplomatic skill that had made him an effective judge and now an effective HOA president. Perfect timing, he said. We were just discussing fall planting schedules. Didn't you mention once that you grew prize-winning chrysanthemums in the 90s? As Patricia cautiously joined the conversation, James caught Frank's eye over her head. The older man winked. Later that afternoon, as James harvested the last of his summer vegetables, he reflected on how his garden had grown into something far more meaningful than a source of fresh produce. It had become the catalyst for community transformation. The following week, a formal envelope appeared in James's mailbox, an echo of the many violation notices Patricia had distributed over the years. Inside, however, was a faded county fair ribbon and a handwritten note. For your tomatoes. They're better than mine were. Still using too much water though. I could show you some techniques, if you're interested. Phew. James smiled. Patricia would probably always be Patricia, but even the toughest gardens could be rehabilitated with the right care. He tucked the ribbon into his gardening journal and made a note to invite her to the fall planting workshop. Sometimes, he thought, getting what you deserve isn't about punishment. It's about finding your proper place in the ecosystem. Patricia's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who tracked their prey. Section 7.3.1 specifically addresses transfer of ownership. All previous approvals are null and void upon property transfer unless specifically reapplied for within 30 days of closing. You're on day, what? 5. From across the fence, a voice called out, "For heaven's sake, Patricia, leave the poor man alone." A cheerful woman in her 60s, with curly gray hair and gardening gloves, waved from the adjacent yard. "I'm Maria Rodriguez, dear. Don't mind Hurricane Patricia. She tried to find me for growing non-conforming roses last spring." Patricia whirled around. "Those climbing roses exceeded the permitted height by 14 inches, Maria. And they're still in violation. And they'll stay that way until the day I die," Maria replied cheerfully, turning back to her own gardening. Patricia's attention snapped back to James, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at his chest. "I'm documenting this violation. All non-conforming vegetable varieties must be removed by sunset, and that soil returned to its previous state until proper approval is obtained." James had spent $247 on his gardening supplies, a significant chunk of his first homeowner budget. The thought of throwing it all away because of some arbitrary rule made his stomach tighten. "And if I don't?" A smile spread across Patricia's face. Not the artificial customer service grimace from earlier, but something predatory and satisfied. "Then I'll be forced to take further action. Fines accumulate at $25 per day, and after 30 days, the HOA has the right to enter the property and remediate the violation at the homeowner's expense, plus administrative fees, of course." She stepped back, brushing invisible dirt from her pristine white pants. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates, Mr. Chen. We're a community that values order and standards. I suggest you familiarize yourself with our rules." She patted the massive binder still in his hands, all 537 pages of them. As Patricia strutted away, pausing to take one more photo of his garden bed, James felt the eyes of several neighbors watching from windows and porches. A text message pinged on his phone, from a number he didn't recognize. "Don't let the HOA dragon win. We're on your side. Your neighbors. Maria gave me your hashtag." James looked up to see a young family across the street, giving him encouraging thumbs up from their porch. Maybe he wasn't alone in this battle after all. He turned back to his garden, determination replacing his earlier frustration. He'd faced difficult project managers and impossible deadlines in his career. One neighborhood busybody with a rulebook wasn't going to stop him from growing his tomatoes. "Game on, Patricia," he murmured, planting the first seedling with deliberate care. James was elbow-deep in garden soil when the police cruiser pulled up in front of his house, lights flashing but siren mercifully silent. His initial confusion turned to disbelief when he spotted Patricia standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed triumphantly as she spoke to a young officer. 3 neighbors had emerged from their homes to watch the scene unfold, curiosity evident on their faces. "Sir, we received a call about trespassing and destruction of private property," the officer said as he approached, looking uncomfortable with the situation. His name badge read Officer Rodriguez. James blinked in astonishment. "Officer, this is my house. I closed on it last Tuesday." He glanced toward Patricia, who was now filming the interaction on her phone. "I'm planting tomatoes in my own backyard. He's in violation of community standards," Patricia called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "That's practically vandalism of our neighborhood aesthetic." A second officer who had been speaking with Patricia approached. "Ma'am claims you're destroying protected landscaping and refused to stop when confronted," he explained, though his tone suggested skepticism. James hurried inside to retrieve his closing documents and ID, heart pounding with indignation. As he returned, he noticed his next-door neighbor, the silver-haired man who had offered help earlier, approaching the scene. "Officers, if I may," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite his gentle tone. "I'm Frank Mercer, retired judge and resident here for 23 years. This young man bought the Miller place last week. Patricia here calls the authorities on every new homeowner who doesn't bow to her interpretation of the HOA rules." Another neighbor stepped forward, a woman in her 40s with gardening gloves still on her hands. "She called the fire department on me for having a birthday party with too many balloons," she added. "Claimed they were a fire hazard." Officer Rodriguez reviewed James' documentation and handed it back with an apologetic smile. "Sir, your paperwork is in order. This is clearly a civil matter between you and the HOA." He turned to Patricia, his professional demeanor hardening. "Ma'am, misuse of emergency services is a serious offense." Patricia's face flushed crimson. "I am protecting this community. Do you have any idea what vegetable gardens do to property values? They attract rabbits, and they attract a $500 fine for improper use of 911. Officer Rodriguez interrupted, pulling out his citation book. "Emergency services are for life-threatening situations, not garden disputes." As Patricia spluttered indignantly, several neighbors had gathered, some openly filming the encounter on their phones. The second officer explained to James that he had the right to file a harassment complaint if the behavior continued. Patricia jabbed a finger toward the growing crowd. "You're all witnesses. This is exactly what happened with the Jenkins family when they tried to install unapproved solar panels. This neighborhood is going downhill because nobody respects the rules anymore." As the officers handed Patricia her citation, Frank leaned toward James. "Welcome to Oakwood Estates," he said with a wry smile. "First HOA citation is a rite of passage around here, but calling the cops, that's new even for Hurricane Patricia." Part 3, The Meeting. The Oakwood Estates Community Center buzzed with unusual energy as homeowners filed in for the monthly HOA meeting. Attendance, typically a sparse showing of the same dozen retirees, had swelled to standing room only. James, who had reluctantly decided to attend, found himself greeted with knowing smiles and supportive nods as he entered. "Quite the turnout," Frank commented, appearing at James' elbow and guiding him to one of the few remaining seats. Word spreads fast when Patricia gets her comeuppance. At the front table, Patricia arranged her papers with military precision, jaw tight as she surveyed the crowd. Flanking her were 2 uncomfortable-looking board members who kept exchanging worried glances. "I move to add an emergency agenda item," called a woman from the back before Patricia could even call the meeting to order. "Discussion of recent abuse of HOA authority and misuse of community funds for personal vendettas." Patricia's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That is not proper procedure, Linda. Items must be submitted in writing 14 days in advance of." "I second the motion," called another voice, followed by a chorus of thirds and fourths.